Thoughts on Thursday. It's Reverend Miller.
And Stuart Holmes.
We're approaching Holy Week, and so next week, Thursday, which we would normally do our thoughts on Thursday, is going to be Maundy Thursday. So what we thought we would do for next week is post our thoughts on Tuesday, so we can give a highlight on the Maundy Thursday service, the Good Friday service, and then the Easter service. The Maundy Thursday service will be at 7:30 p.m. in the Fellowship Hall, so it won't be live streamed. It's with the foot washing and communion. It didn't seem like there was a big need. It's more of an interactive than a virtual. The Good Friday service will be virtual, live on Friday, starting at 7:30 p.m. It's also going to be here in person. So both those will be wonderful events. We're going to explain a little bit more about all those things and also the Stations of the Cross, which will happen on Good Friday, all next week. But in Lent, we've been talking about vocation and calling and God's transformation of our lives. So last week we interviewed Stuart, and yeah, people were impressed, I think. And then this week it's my turn to be interviewed by Stuart. So I'm excited for this time and just to have further conversation.
So, start off, you've talked a lot during your sermons about your growing up outside of the church and then inside of the church, but there are some people that are on the list that have not been to our services. So can you summarize?
Sure. That's the difference, I guess, between the preacher and the organist. The organist, well, once in a while we'll talk about a prelude or a postlude, but it doesn't have the same amount of verbal, vocal time when it comes to talking. Yeah, so in fact, I did not grow up going to church. You know, some people who know me as a minister think I was born with a collar on, which is not the truth. I grew up in a wonderful family, and it wasn't really until the age of 16 where I was beginning to wonder about who God was that I decided I wanted to kind of think about that. My mom grew up conservative Baptist, and at the age of 18 told her parents she's never going to church again. And my dad, he grew up Methodist. He was actually studying to be a Methodist minister, and he actually was, at that time, what they would call ordained as a deacon, so he could marry, bear, and baptize people. But when he was in seminary at Boston University of Boston, he couldn't write on a piece of paper that there was a God, so they kicked him out. And so that is the formation of my parents in my life. I'm the youngest of three boys. We grew up with great parents, active parents, but we didn't go to church. The church experience I would have would be several times a year visiting my grandparents, Frank and Doris Westlake, and we would go to their Baptist church. Often I would take a nap during the 45-minute sermon, or on the dreaded days I was sent to Sunday school during worship, not knowing anybody. And so I didn't know all the churchy church stuff. And at the age of 16, I thought I wanted to know more about God. I told my grandpa, Westlake, that if my parents went to church, I would go to church. And he looked at me and he said, "Robbie, how old are you?" And I said, "Grandpa, you know, I'm 16. He said, "Well, you can go to church by yourself. You're old enough." And so that's when I was confronted. Do I really want to, and do I not? And I told my parents. I'm sure they had a conversation on who's going to go with this kid to make sure he doesn't get wrapped up in a cult. And I think my dad was wanting. So fast forward, my mom and dad began to go to church. Our lives began to change because of that. And it happened. We looked at a few churches, and we came across one called Faith Reformed Church in Traverse City, Michigan. And Edna Stevens greeted us so warmly that we stayed.
Now, was that a Reformed church in America?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so that's how you.
That's how I got in there. Friendliness. I remember that first Sunday because Reverend Lemon was preaching. He was retired, but he was filling in that day. And I just remember him saying how sinful we were over and over and over again. And I was like, man, are we really that bad? Not going to church. I wasn't used to that that language. And so that's, along that, and a lot of people think it's a cheesy poem, but Footprints, I remember reading that like at 15, 16 and seeing that, and like wondering, is there a God out there, something greater than me? And that just spoke to me. So it wasn't just, do I want to go to church? It was really, is there something greater than the physical things we see? Is there God? And that's...
So the process of asking yourself those questions, did that kind of just morph over time into what you realized was a call into the ministry? Or?
Well, as we got involved into church, and I was involved in church and also a youth group. I did the catechism, all the good stuff you used to do in the Reformed Church. And
the Episcopal Church, I might add.
And the Episcopal Church. And you have to have the catechism. We don't do the catechism as much. I love it. And so the first 2 sermons I've ever preached was when I was a junior in high school and a senior in high school.
Oh.
At a very large church, 700 people in worship. And
is that a youth Sunday? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was the case. But I remember probably when I was 17 and our associate minister was preaching, Nick Toomey, and I turned to my parents and said, being a minister might not be too bad. My parents heard me say, I am going to be a minister. I didn't say that. I'll tell you that to my dad again. But that, and then just certain people saying, have you thought about that? And kind of bringing out that call. It was an up and down thing. Didn't do very well my freshman year. You do need degrees to be a minister. And so...
Freshman year in undergrad.
College. Yeah, undergrad. And so, my call has evolved and changed and more.
So then you went to seminary after undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know too much about that.
Okay.
So what was your life like in seminary?
So when I graduated from Hope College, my wife Danielle still had 2 more years at Hope. We, being wise, we got married that summer. And I really felt called to youth ministry, which I still love working with teenagers and young and children. And I thought, well, I'm married, maybe I'll become a youth director, and then when Danielle graduates, or maybe I'll do seminary part-time. But I had a friend who was going to Western. He said, well, if you're thinking about Western, they got these beautiful townhouses. You should at least put your name in there. So I put my name in. We're doing stuff, getting ready. I get another apartment with Danielle, and then I hit the seminary calls and says, oh, your townhouse is ready. I thought to myself, fantastic, it's close for Danielle. Maybe I should sign up for some classes too. So I go to Western, I'm walking down this very long hall. The building's now a little different, not knowing where to go, and a person bumps into me and says, can I help you? And I said, yeah, I need to sign up for some classes. He's like, oh, okay, I'm the dean, come with me. And boom. I always felt called and I wanted to go to seminary. I just didn't know, being married, if that was the right time.
Yeah. And
so that's how it started. When I went to Western Seminary, it was a bit smaller. The next year, it grew and grew. And I was probably the last part of an older curriculum. And it was tri-semesters, 3 semesters each year. And I liked it because I was trained to be a minister, not a youth minister or a senior minister. I was trained, and my emphasis was actually pastoral care, which I have an interest in.
Wow. And
so you intern while you're doing that. I even worked at a pizza place a little bit when I did that. And I finished my seminary career by doing what they call clinical pastoral education at Pine Rest Hospital in Grand Rapids, and that was a whole summer. So, there was some preaching in there, there was education classes, there was Greek and Hebrew languages, which I think they tried to kill me with those, but I made it through. And so, that's the rhythm of the seminary life. There's chapel every day. You lead chapel second semester you start your preaching class. That's when I started preaching, and so
Did you have mentors at that point?
Sure. I mean, I had mentors along the way, and so one of the associate pastors at my home church was Ron Spence. He's still alive, but he's no longer there. He was a big mentor of mine and brought me, encouraged me. Then when I was at Hope College, I interned at Christ Memorial Church in the youth program, and Chris Peters was the director, and so he was a mentor of mine. He was trained in Young Life, so I was also, because of that, trained in Young Life. And so as I got into seminary, one of my professors became the president the year before, Dennis Fosco, so he was always a mentor. But Stan Rock was the professor of pastoral care. He was a big mentor of mine. He taught me a thing called systems theory that has made a big impact in my life. Sometimes I wish I could turn that thinking off, because you see different things. But so he was a big mentor. Andy Farrow, I interned at a bilingual church, Spanish, English. He was the pastor there. He was a great mentor, and he taught.
You had a lot of mentors.
Well, people like me. I'm talking. These are some people along the way.
Wow.
There was a lot of other professors. Certain professors Chris Kaiser, I loved him as a professor. He had a PhD in astrophysics and a PhD in systematic theology.
The systems world worked its way into education too. It's a big byword.
Yeah.
10, 15, 20 years ago.
Well, I graduated
Still
from
around.
seminary in 1998, so it's been 24 years since I've been in
much
seminary.
You talked a little bit of mentors. Is there a preacher that stood out?
Well, Stan Rock, Tim Brown was a preaching professor, fantastic preacher. But my favorite preacher was Stan Rock. He had, at this point, Parkinson's disease. He's now deceased. But he preached in a way that he included the whole chapel service or worship experience was all wrapped up together, from soups to nuts, as they say. And that had an impact, and it wasn't just words, it was all the senses and really creating a worshipful environment. I really appreciated his preaching within that.
And many people outside of our congregation don't know that you went to California. Do you want to tell a little bit about that?
So I went, after seminary, Ron Spence was at the Crystal Cathedral, and they were looking for someone in the youth department, so I applied, and that was my first call. I loved the Crystal Cathedral. It felt like vacation for my wife and I almost, because we're far away from family. Our daughter Blythe was born there, and I worked primarily with junior high students, and so
Bless you.
in that first year, we had like 100 junior high students, and I remember going home exhausted after a meeting with them, trying to keep, and them taking me serious wasn't happening quite at that moment. You as a teacher, right? You develop your chops in authority. I was still getting there. One of the things I really loved about the Crystal Cathedral is I was working with a group that I really loved and cared for, but I also, I was the minister of the day once a week, if there was emergencies, I did that. I did funerals, I did weddings, so I was able to do, and then there was a chapel service I could preach at, so it was some wonderful ministers there too. Jim Koch was the pastoral care, he was wonderful. Tino Ballesteros.
You were mixed in with all these other ministers.
There was
and
14
lay people.
ministers at that time.
That had different facets, so that it was a really.
So it was a large, different than what here. So I went from there to a church that was only 10 years old as the associate pastor there. So it was a totally different experience.
A lot of different people were available at Crystal, I assume, to be able to turn to and say,
Yeah.
okay, what, or at least observe.
Yeah, there was a minister who oversaw several things, but also included the preaching school. There was a preaching school there, and I did that, and that was Reverend Dr. Lawrence Wilkes, not the singer. But the man loved puns. He passed away a few years ago, but 2 days ago, his daughter, in memory of his passing, posted a video of him preaching at the Crystal Cathedral.
Oh.
And he was a fine preacher. He actually is the one who took over during the bankruptcy, and he was the lead preacher until
Wow.
Bobby took over.
Wow. So let's change direction a little. Talk about sermon writing. Tell us a little bit about your
Okay.
process.
So what both Stuart and I do, we usually plan at least a month in advance. So I'm creating the bulletin. I pick the hymns. If you want,
Most of the time.
if the hymn's not good, sure, blame Stuart. But so I have to, in general, like for my sermon, I've already have my sermon title. So I do, within kind of looking at 4 to 5 weeks together, I'm looking at all the passages, and I'm writing a sermon title, and I do, a beginning study within those texts, so that I can create a worship service, create a sermon title. And so I already have in my mind certain things. Then the starting of the week on a Monday, I will begin to look more deeply into that passage. So I do the exegetical work, trying to figure out what this passage is saying, looking at some historical parts, looking at some biblical criticism, and figuring that out. And so each day of the week, I'm developing that. So, for instance, this last sermon I talked about Chris Rock being slapped by Will Smith. That wasn't probably added into the sermon until Thursday, actually, as I was looking at and seeing already what I think the text is saying. Then I might pull things out.
Right.
And so even by Saturday, I can still add things. I come in on Sunday morning, usually before 7 a.m. I go through the sermon, maybe to make some changes. I don't write a manuscript, but I write notes, and that's kind of how I click through those notes in my mind. But I write them down. I have them on the computer. Usually, since here at Old Paramus we do the lectionary, that's a 3-year cycle. I don't always preach on the same passages. Sometimes there might be some different ones, but I will reference back to see what I have said and what my notes said, usually towards the end of the week, because I don't want to be influenced by those when I first start. I want to kind of get a fresh perspective. Then I'm maybe like, oh, I've already quoted this, I already did that, depending on.
It's amazing to me you're able to compartmentalize. I almost didn't get that word out. From a musician standpoint, I guess it's the same for you. 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, you started to morph with this idea. And I often find myself gravitating to one idea in the music. And for me, I have problems separating it and focusing it on the week. I think that's an admirable trait. In your process of writing sermons, do you find that you have a favorite book in the Bible?
Those change.
Yesterday.
Well, I'm finding more and more as I'm appreciating each of the Gospels for who they are, so to speak, and the nuances they bring out. And there's a biblical scholar, last name Donahue. He's in that biblical category as he wants to look at what that gospel is saying, and not just mix all the gospels together, and the details in that gospel are put together for a certain reason. So it's really looking at the narrator, John, Mark, Matthew, Luke, the authors of those, and seeing what they're trying to communicate to us.
So that changes according
So I'm finding like, oh, I love Mark. And then if we're in because we're, and then we move into Luke, and I'm loving Luke for being Luke. So
Yeah.
I've always loved the Psalms, and I know some people don't. The Psalms speak to me
As do
because they speak to the human emotion,
I was
to
gonna
the
say,
joys,
right.
and remind me that we can yell at God, because they do. So that's a book that I always gravitate back to.
Interesting, yeah. The Psalms for musicians are wonderful,
Yeah.
because of that emotional.
The prophets, I'm moved by the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and even all of them, what we call the minor prophets, looking at. I've always been interested in ethics, and I think prophets are kind of that ethical of what our faith does in action and what we're supposed to be doing.
So you depending on what book you're in, that tends to be at the top of your list.
Mhm.
What about seasons? We're in Lent now, and
What season do I like?
what
huh?
season?
You know what? I'm a fan of Lent. I definitely, the idea of reflection and repentance. But I've through my journey, I've probably become. I'm not quite Anglican, but I like the higher church liturgy, written liturgy, and also the season.
I knew you'd come around eventually.
And the rhythm of that,
Yeah.
So I do like the rhythm of the seasons we see in the calendar. I love Advent, that waiting and expectation. Epiphany is just God's light shining forth. So there's not many I don't like.
Epiphany is such a I was going to say misunderstood, but a missed celebration
Yeah.
in the church. And with music, I'm finding that I find that it's very easy for a choir or a congregation to say, "Oh, the music is so dull or so heavy and everything," but you don't experience that same kind of experience with Lent.
Well, that's to me is
Didn't need that.
to me. I guess speaking of the liturgical calendar, the rhythm of life, and I know, like being at the Crystal Cathedral, it was always up. We always sang "Joyful, Joyful," the first hymn, joyful, joy. Positive, positive, positive. I find life, and their idea was that the positive helps you deal with all the negative. For my rhythm and the way I look at life, the darker and the deeper speaks to something. So to me, it's not always mountaintop; it's valleys too.
Right.
And so to have all that within the calendar year and within music, back to Psalms, they're not all praises.
Right.
Psalm 100 is, right? The 23rd Psalm we love so much. It says, "Prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." The enemies aren't gone, It's so to me, I like a full spectrum of those things.
Oh,
I think it speaks to life.
We've often talked about you can't experience the highs without the lows, or vice versa. And I think that is so true.
And I try to, back to seminary, there was a professor I found incredibly boring. I'm not going to say his name. And I could barely pay attention to him. After seminary, I realized it was my job to pay attention to him. It wasn't his job to entertain me. And so I try to, even in worship, appreciate other aspects that might not necessarily communicate to me.
Yeah.
Like if we go to all our favorites,
Yeah, we lose that.
we lose a depth. And maybe, for instance, this church is going to have a hard time believing this, but I didn't drink coffee until I was 39. I didn't like the taste. Now I like the taste. So if you only gravitate towards the things that you like or make you feel good at that moment, you might be missing out on other things. So that's,
Wow.
but I'm looking at things in a different way. I don't, I'm not necessarily coming to church because I love the preacher. I am the preacher. You know, I mean, I'm coming to church for a different reason than I picked
Well,
because.
you have to, we all have to, leaders of the church have to get something out of it that feeds us too, so.
And so that's, I mean, it's, to see a different tradition, to see a different, I know you love gospel hymns, one of your favorite, but, you know, and there's something wonderful about those gospel hymns. They always have a refrain that's a hook that just brings you in, right? You know, so to appreciate those things for what they are, and
So we're coming to the end of our time. My last question was really a loaded question,
boy.
and I don't know. I warned you about
who's
this.
the favorite person I've ever worked with? Is that what
No, it is, you know, where do you see the church going? You know, we're in turbulent times here.
This is, you know, I've been thinking about that. Less and less people are going to church. We've been thinking this and dealing with it almost my whole time as a minister, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
unfortunately, it feels to me it's only panicked us and hasn't made. And I've been thinking about that is, I feel that we as a church proper, and even here at Old Paramus, we feel less about ourselves because of what's happening around us, and don't always realize what we have. So a few months ago, on Ridgewood's mom and dad's Facebook page, someone was looking for a church that had a good youth group. People were posting their thing. Well, we don't have enough youth right now to have a youth group, but I posted, Old Paramus is a wonderful church. We have wonderful music, it is traditional, and if you're looking for a place that has 40 grandparents, we're the place.
Yeah.
But we think, oh, we don't have youth groups, we have nothing to offer. We have grandparents. We have things to offer. I find my hope for the church is to realize what they have to offer, not to feel bad about who we are, but to embrace who we are. You always change and challenge yourself, but know that we have a lot to offer. And as I'm looking at the church, you know, for us here at Old Paramus, Babinski's time was the big benchmark, right?
Right.
It was here, they went from 100 people in worship, almost 400 people in worship, 2 services, Sunday school kids all over the place. And there's a sense that everyone wants to go back to that. But being 297 years old, you have a lot of history to look at. And I feel like we can look at and determine maybe who we are right now is not that time of Babinski's era, which actually was post-World War II, new neighborhoods, people were going to church then.
Right.
But other moments of our church history we could look at and see what they did and have answers. To me, that's the exciting part. Not just to say, oh, we're failing, oh, not, you know, soccer, people are going to soccer or this. To say, no, we have things to offer. It might not look like our heyday, but it might look like at another time where we were successful because we were who we were, we reached out, and we cared for people.
You're talking a lot about this church, but it really is for the church as a whole.
It's for the whole church. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, it's interesting because I've spent a lot of time doing youth ministry. The heyday of youth ministry was followed by the decline of the church.
Yeah.
So there's a sense that maybe it wasn't as good as we thought because as we're trying to, what does it mean, you know? And I just think we have a lot to offer church. From my own experience, I know what it's like not to be in church and what it is to be in church and to know God. And so I think we have stuff to offer. We have to know who we are and be secure in that too. I mean, there's a lot of churches out there. And so people can go to a certain church because of who they are. They can come to our church because of who we are. It's about making those relationships and those connections. So I still have hope.
As do I.
And he put it on my list. He didn't ask what is one of my favorite theologians, Karl Barth. And I love.
Oh, I missed that.
I love. He's a pretty smart guy, but he has, and I'm only paraphrasing, and I've used it in sermons before. And he says that Jesus Christ is the head of the church. And so that the church can fail and almost look dying, but it will never die because Jesus is the head of the church. And he's already conquered death.
Yeah.
You know, so it gives us a perspective of, we're going to die. It's like, no, the church proper will always live because Christ is the head of the church. It doesn't mean we can act like we're dying, but it takes, it's not about us saving. Jesus is already saved. So it's about us connecting to that. It's about having hope that we continue to see throughout the whole biblical story, remnants of people being gathered together and great things happening.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the end of my question.
That's a lot of thoughts on Thursday.
Yeah.
I might have beat.
I think you beat the record. We are keeping score on this.
Yes. Well, thank you for coming to Thoughts on Thursday. We hope to see you on Sunday, Palm Sunday. We are going to be meeting outside if you're in person. We also will be live streaming. It'll be a wonderful service. And then we'll see you next Tuesday for our thoughts. Thanks for joining us.
Great.
Have a great day.